Right, I think we best get started just in case people are doing this over their lunch times.
Yeah.
We've got 14 people. We were expecting a few more, but it may be that they just join in a little bit later. So just by way of introduction, everyone, my name is Connie. I am a family barrister at Spire Barristers, and then my co-host Pip is also, she is a pupil barrister at Spire, doing both family and court of protection work. So this afternoon we are providing this online seminar to look at whether social workers should be visiting families during the current pandemic that we are all trying our best to work around. So the agenda for today, firstly, we're going to look at the guidance which the government have passed, and we will then look at a working example, which is from a case that I have been involved with, the implications that we have been able to see from looking at cases where this has become an issue, or at least something that has arisen within cases. And then Pip will go through the recommendations on how we think that doing these visits can be best done, if at all possible. And finally, we will look to the future, looking at, we now know that the courts are starting to open up, so hopefully we can get back to some form of normality sooner rather than later. So first of all, I will pass over to Pip, who will go through the guidance that the government have passed.
Yeah, so looking at what we've been told so far and the sort of updates and the amendments that have been made, firstly, it's important to kind of start off with what hasn't changed. So the duties that I'm sure you're all really familiar with under Section 22(3) of the Children Act and Section 1 of the Adoption and Children Act are still in place and are the overriding consideration when you're looking at visiting families. So they are really to put the children first, to promote their welfare, and that must be borne in mind at all times. So these things remain the same and should still come first in your mind, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, when you're then thinking about the changes that are subsequent to that. The amendments that have been put in place really are, so they're within the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendments Regulations, that's a mouthful, and it's Section 13 of those regulations that make changes, and they really make changes to the care planning regulations 2010 that you'll all be aware of. What they do is, initially they allow virtual visits, so this specifically says telephone, video link, or other electronic means. So really it is up to you guys to decide the best means to remotely conduct a visit that isn't dictated by the regulation. And then secondly, when you make a decision that an in-person visit can't take place within your 6-week timescale, that's the usual statutory timescale, it's changed the regulation to say that that visit can take place as soon as is reasonably practicable. So you're no longer under the duty to visit every 6 weeks in your statutory visits. It can be extended, but it must be as soon as is reasonably practicable, not just a delay without due cause. So this flexibility that we've been allowed must be used only when absolutely necessary, and that is stressed throughout all of the guidance and the regulations. So really consider whether using the flexibility that you've been allowed is what you really need to do, or whether you could do it within the usual timeframes and methods. Senior management oversight is required when you're considering using the flexibility, and this is consulting with your team manager and those higher up, and you should try and consult them as soon as you think that you might need to use the flexibility. As soon as the idea comes into your head that you can't comply with the original regulations and you might need extra time, or you might need a remote visit, then consult with somebody as soon as that becomes evident to you. As we've already been through, the use of any flexibility needs to still be consistent with the safeguarding duties that you have. So really it's ensuring that the welfare of the children involved isn't sacrificed by the need to be flexible. How do we translate this into practice then? So looking at the possible scenarios there, When there are health risks posed by visiting families, you need to balance those risks with the welfare duties which we have to the children. The guidance has suggested scenarios where the new flexibility might be used, and the suggestions that they make are when you have staff shortages within your local authority, which make it impossible to meet the requirement of the statutory visits. Secondly, where demands on the services can't be met. So a risk-based approach is suggested, prioritising the children who are most at risk first, conducting those visits, and then looking to the children and the families who are less at risk. And then finally, where people who you work with as outside bodies and as third parties, so to speak, can't work to the same level or to the same time frames as you might be used to, and so you can't comply with your original timescales because of those outside factors. So these are the things that we've been told by the guidance might be situations in which the flexibility that's been allowed should be used. And as I said, it's something that you'll have to decide on a case-by-case basis. There may be other scenarios, and it's something that discussion should be had about to decide whether it warrants the use of the flexibility. As a reminder, in the guidance we're given, the long-standing principles need to be thought of, need to be kept in mind when you're making the decisions of who to visit, when to visit, or if not to visit at all. And those are to be child-centred, to have a risk-based approach, to prioritising those greatest at risk, to remain family-focused, to be evidence-informed, to be collaborative, and to be transparent. So those aren't on the slide because I'm sure they're things that you're already aware of and have been working with for a long time, but those are the kind of things to consider when you're looking at using the flexibility or not. In balancing the risk, the guidance has given us some things to think about when we're looking at in-person visits or remote visits specifically, and what needs to be considered when we're looking at what type of visit should take place. So it will be complex, it won't be clear-cut and evident easily in every circumstance, but the risks really which are to be weighed up are the risks to the child or the children of having the visit, also of not having that visit, what the risks posed to the children are. This might be in cases particularly where you have children with immune deficiencies, those kind of things that would make them susceptible to the virus, or children who are at risk of not being seen by you in the home. The second thing we need to balance out is the risk to the families of the visit as a whole, and the risk if the visit is or is not conducted. And then finally, the risk to the workforce, to the risks to yourselves of going to these houses. And when you consider that, you need to also be thinking about the risk to the other social workers who you'll come into contact with, the other people who you work with who you'll come into contact with after a visit, and the general widespread risk amongst yourselves, because you guys need to be safe as well as the families that you're visiting. So these are the kind of things to balance up when we're working out if it should be a remote visit or an in-person visit. So if all of these things considered and the decision is made to do an in-person visit, there really needs to be consideration to start with of how to make that visit as safe as possible. So before visiting, you should conduct a risk assessment with the family over the telephone, or that can be done by a video call. I think that's up to your personal preference on that one. But during the call, you should really try and ascertain whether anyone in the household has suffered or is suffering with any symptoms of COVID-19. Those symptoms are really easily available online. I'm sure you've all read them countless times, but they do keep changing, so it's worth just keeping up to date with what the symptoms are. And needless to say, any social workers who are showing symptoms shouldn't be undertaking in-person visits at all. So if you have your risk assessment and the family tells you no one has symptoms, the visit can take place safely without the need for PPE, but social distancing and hand washing guidance remains in place and really remains crucial. If the family report that someone in the household does have symptoms or suspected symptoms, the guidance tells us that PPE should be worn if the visit cannot be conducted socially distant. So this will almost certainly require PPE if the social worker if you guys are required to enter the home, because the virus can be living on surfaces, it can be spread easier in enclosed spaces, indoors. So anywhere with symptoms, the guidance tells us if you can be socially distanced, you don't need PPE, but realistically, if you're going inside the home, take PPE. If you're unsure, finally, whether someone in the home has symptoms or not, so if your risk assessment was unclear, if the family aren't sure, the advice tells us that you should knock on the door, move 2 meters back and speak to the family to ascertain whether it's safe to conduct a visit then. You should take PPE, of course, in this case, because we don't know whether it would be required or not. And you might have difficulty speaking to the family to work out symptoms, whether they have them, what they are. So just having that information to hand will be helpful as well. The PPE requirements and what they are, I've got in a table to in a second, so you can see what PPE you should be taking, if at all. Really, the guidance tells us it's not necessary if you can be distant. But if you at all feel you're going to be in close contact or touching surfaces, then safety first. I think PPE would be the way to ensure the safety rather than chance it. If we move then to the right-hand side of this slide, the family might refuse entry, stating health risks. They might not want you to come into the home. So if that situation arises, I think firstly, we're being told to explain why you're there, why you think it's important to speak to the family, and possibly why you're asking to go inside the home. It might be helpful to explain the measures that you've taken to ensure their safety and to reduce the risk of the virus spreading. And it might also be helpful to explain to the family why the visit isn't being conducted remotely and why you feel the need to have an in-person visit, and how it might be helpful for them for you to have an in-person visit. As I'm sure you'll all be aware and will probably agree, it will invoke a range of different responses from different families, and it'll be a judgment call for you guys as to how best to approach each family and how best to explain it to them to ensure that the visit begins safely. And in the, potentially likely circumstance that access is still refused to the home, we are being told that if you still consider at this point that there are immediate risks of serious harm to the children, then the usual procedure follows of child protection procedures, and that is on the back of refusal, explanation, continued refusal. As I just referred to, this is a table that we've been given. Sorry that the text is incredibly small. I'll try and get these slides out to you guys so you can have a closer look. But it's the third category down on the left that would apply to social workers visiting families. And just briefly, this advises that the PPE for you guys would be gloves, an apron, and a surgical mask as single use. This is, so the guidance that the government are updating and providing is on this link. So I'll try and get these slides out to you. And just a note that it is being reviewed today or yesterday to be updated today. So things may change and update, but that link should keep you up to date with anything additional to what we've been through today. Connie, do you want to take up?
So I will, yeah, of course, there's a bit of a delay, I think, problem with virtual anything at the moment. So I'm just going to talk to you briefly just about a case that I have been involved in over the last couple of weeks. And basically what has happened is that the local authority have issued care proceedings during the government imposed lockdown. And this is in relation to a child who I will call Callum. That's not their actual name, but just to keep for confidentiality in place, I'll refer to the child as Callum. So by way of background in this case, the local authority have had somewhat long-standing concerns. They at least go back to last year regarding Callum's mother being involved in a domestically violent relationship, possible drug misuse, failing to prioritise Callum's needs, and also failing to engage with professionals. The last one is particularly important at the moment when there just really is no insight into what's going on within this family. So following an incident at the end of last year, Callum moved to live with his grandparents. This was with the agreement of his mother, and Callum and his mother continued to have contacts during this time. This included overnight contact. In April this year, Callum was staying with his mother overnight, and she developed coronavirus symptoms, or reported to have developed coronavirus symptoms. So following the government guidance, this meant that she had to self-isolate for 7 days and Callum had to self-isolate for 14 days. Therefore, Callum remained in the care of his mother. An agreement was reached whereby Callum would return to the care of his grandparents 2 weeks later. Sadly, at the end of those 2 weeks, Callum's mother refused to return Callum to the grandparents' care, and shortly thereafter, the decision was taken by the local authority to issue proceedings. Pip, if you could just change the slide for me, please. So why is this case relevant to this seminar? Well, during the time that Callum remained in the care of his mother, within that initial 2 weeks and shortly thereafter, the local authority did what they could to manage the situation. Although this meant that the social worker was only able to undertake arranged doorstep visits once per week. So she wasn't able to go inside the property at all. And given the concerns that the local authority had, this made this situation very difficult. You'll all be aware, I'm sure, that naturally it's easier for parents to prepare for announced rather than unannounced visits. And also the only opportunity that this social worker had to speak to Callum was a brief conversation on the doorstep whilst his mother was stood next to him. Pip, if you could just change the slide for me. Thank you. And if you could change it again. So what are the implications? What difficulties may arise if families are not visible to the local authority? Could change the slide, please. So looking at the implications in this case that I have been involved with specifically, what would be the case if Callum had wanted to tell the social worker something, but he didn't have the chance to because he didn't want to say it in front of his mother? I'm sure that you'll all agree that the doorstep visit is not indicative of this child's lived environment. Given the concerns that the local authority had, it was almost impossible to know whether there was anyone else in the property. Perhaps the mother had entered into a new relationship and we wouldn't have known who that person was, whether there were any risks involved. It was also impossible to know if there had been any drug paraphernalia inside the house. These were concerns that had been risen and hadn't yet been addressed. It was also unclear what Callum's lived environment looked like for the other 23 hours plus of the day. If you couple those concerns with the very limited face-to-face contact that the social worker had with Callum, and of course mother's failure to engage with professionals, the concerns do become very real for this child. But how do the local authority then meet the very high test for an interim care order and removal? Namely, that Callum was suffering or was at risk of suffering significant harm, and his safety demanded his immediate separation. Realistically, in that case, the thrust of the local authority's case is we don't know what's happening within the home, but is that enough to meet the test? Arguably it's not, because the mother could argue, well, it's speculation and the local authority have no evidence of a specific incident or incidents which mean that the test is met. Fortunately, in that case, there were other issues relating to Callum, and this did result in the court concluding that the test was met, but that will not always be the case in these cases where the social workers are unable to get inside the house to see really what's going on, to speak to a child on their own. If you could just change the slide for me, Pip, please. So now we want to look at cases more generally. The issue remains that if visits are not undertaken regularly, or perhaps undertaken on an announced doorstep or virtual basis, it's simply very difficult for the local authority to get a clear and full picture of what's happening within the home that they go to or don't go to. We all know that a lot of harm is caused to children behind closed doors, and we largely rely on unannounced home visits and disclosures from children to professionals to establish a child has suffered that harm or is at least at risk of suffering that harm. If the insides of homes are not visible to professionals and parents are able to prepare children and themselves for visits and be present throughout, we will see a reduction in local authorities knowing, or at least being able to establish, that harm is being caused to these children. This may be somewhat mitigated by video calls, because at least you'd have a view into the home. But again, these can sadly be prepared for, because it's unlikely that you'd be able to organise a video call and say, can you please be ready in 5 minutes? But it is definitely something to consider. Sadly, the evidence at the moment is that harm being caused to children is on the rise. Of course, we both absolutely acknowledge that at the moment everyone's safety is paramount, but this must include the safety of the children. And ensuring the local authority safeguarding duties are complied with involves a difficult balancing exercise, because you've got to balance the safety to these children, which may be caused by external factors and things that are going on within the home, and the safety of the child from coronavirus. And also that then applies to both you and their family as well. So I will now pass back to Pip. She will take you through the recommendations that we've come up with on how to undertake that balancing exercise and how to undertake visits if they are needed.
So firstly, looking at if in-person visits are undertaken, it's important to look at how they might change, because inevitably they will be changed, but what can be done to make them as safe and as efficient as possible, starting with the planning of the visit. You might, I'm sure, already not have much time to spare, but really what the guidance requires is more time to plan at all where that's possible. There are so many more considerations than in a usual visit. Things like how many people are in the home, how big is the home, are there close neighbours, is it a terraced house or a semi-detached house, is there a private outdoor space available? All these things that if you visited the home before, you may know and may assist you in deciding how to conduct the visit as safely as possible. And they're things that really need to go into the planning that ordinarily you wouldn't have thought about. And then in addition to that, the risk assessment by telephone prior to the visit, which also needs to be done in time to source some PPE if you need to take it with you. The next thing to consider really will be getting to and from the visit as safely as possible, both for your own safety and for that of the family. As the guidance across the board has told us, if you can travel alone in your own vehicle, I know that won't always be possible, and so the social distancing measures that are in place on public transport will help reduce any risks that are posed by the travel. But really, if you can, we're being told to travel alone in your own vehicles. And then finally, in order to assist the visits that you do take on, and keeping all of the children that you're responsible for, so to speak, safe, really what we need to be doing is prioritizing. So if you have visits where the planning and the visit itself is taking longer than usual, you will have a lot less time. I'm sure your diaries are absolutely full to the brim, and so you really don't want to be in a position of planning a visit to a particularly vulnerable or particularly high risk family at the end of the day, and then seeing different families throughout the day and running out of time to make that really high risk visit possible at the end of the day. All children and families need to be seen, and the visits that you undertake are incredibly valuable, but really because of the constraints that we have now and the situation that we're in, if the high risk families and the vulnerable children can be seen at the start of the day or the start of the week, to ensure that those visits are undertaken and not missed off the list due to the increased time pressures that I'm sure you guys are trying to cope with at the moment. To help with the time constraints, it might be useful if the visits are more focused than they might normally be. So again, adding to your planning time, identifying prior to the visit the central concerns and the things that you're looking for in this one family or with these specific children, what the history is, what the risk pose are, and what the things that you're trying to work out or decipher are. And then once you undertake the visit, you'll have in mind the very specific things, and it might be that the visit can't be as full as it might ordinarily be, but if you're able to address the issues that are really in the forefront of this family's difficulties, then that might alleviate some of the time pressures as well that you're under. In terms of remote visits then, when in-person visits are not deemed suitable, so there are a number of things that we can do to try and make those as useful and as streamlined as possible. Initially, I'm sure you're already aware of this, but just confirming the time and date of the remote visit will be essential. Knowing whether the family can access the Zoom platform, Teams, if they have good internet connection or not, all those little details will help time not be wasted in the planning and in preparation for the visit. Once you have a virtual visit underway, if you feel a need to speak to the child alone and you think that might be beneficial, you could consider whether that could be done safely over the remote visit. So if you visited this home before, you might know of a room or an area that the child could go to in order to speak with you privately and safely. Although I appreciate that might be incredibly difficult in some homes or with some families, but it might be possible. If the child is old enough, you may also consider communicating with them over typing things into a chat facility. For example, on Zoom, they have a chat box that you could send messages in without having to verbalise their concerns or any allegations, things like that. It's something that will be for you guys to decide on a case-by-case basis, but it might be a useful facility when the children are old enough and you think it's appropriate. Unscheduled visits, as Connie was mentioning, will be really important for you to try and get a realistic view of what's going on in the home, and they might be really difficult to be doing remotely. It's very easy just to not pick up the call and say it was your internet connection going dodgy, things like that. But if you can, they'll be useful in order to have that kind of honest reflection of what's going on in the home without the family having that sort of time to prepare. After the visit then, the remote visits, I would consider the most useful thing that you could do is really provide a note that's as detailed as you can make it to record what's happened. It'll be difficult, the time pressure is there, but really you can identify through this note what was happening, what the home conditions were like, the appearance and presentation of the family and the children, and what's going on at the time. So that will help you monitor between visits what's changed, if there are any differences, where there was a bruise one time there wasn't the last time, those kind of things, really, so you can track the progress of the family and the changes in a really detailed way, given that you can't go in person. Another thing, again, time consuming, but to have closer liaison with the schools or the nurseries if the children are attending. I know that contact with them is already difficult at times, and it's attempted to be as often as possible, but really strengthening that communication would just help to share the information as regularly as possible and keep you up to date with any things that you may need to know, for example, that might spark the need for an unscheduled visit or a socially distant visit, those kind of things. And finally, I think what will be really helpful would be you may already have these, but to have a portfolio of online resources that you can send to the families during a virtual visit or afterwards by an email or a text. And these could be resources such as the assistance for people suffering from domestic abuse, the food banks, when they're open, how long they're open, where they are, that kind of thing, and information on benefit payments, those kind of things, because these services have adapted. They are changing how they're working during lockdown. And so if you have these resources to hand, it'd be incredibly useful just to hand out to families as and when they need them, quite promptly, and saving you doing more work trying to find the resources in the future. Just pass you back to Connie then to look at preparing for the long term and when we finally are released from lockdown. Oh, Connie, you are just muted. There you go.
I think I'm back now.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the information that we are all getting at the moment is that domestic and child abuse is rising during lockdown. So what can we all do to prepare for what will inevitably be a huge influx of work? Pip, if you could just change the slide for me, please. So every day we're receiving new suggestions about how we will return to some form of normality. At the moment, it is unclear how that will be done and at what pace that will be done, in particular to your respective roles and our roles. But it is clear that that's where we are heading now. So the first thing that I think needs to be considered moving forward is staffing levels. It may be that if they remain the same, and I know that a lot of the social workers that I work with are already dealing with huge caseloads, but if the staffing levels remain the same as they are now, that may lead to these caseloads excuse me, becoming unmanageable. So I think that the local authorities need to consider whether recruitment is necessary and at what level and scale this needs to be at. And this needs to be considered now, because there needs to be time to ensure that there's sufficient time for training for these new individuals so that they are ready to go when we get to the point of at least a return to some form of normality and these cases going effectively through the roof. I mean, we are also expecting the same to happen within the courts. So secondly, reverting back to the recommendations that Pip's just gone through with everybody, it may be that remote visits are appropriate long term in some cases, and this may help with the time pressure on professionals travelling between the homes. I know that a lot of time can be spent going from house to house, and if it's a case where perhaps the children are not at an immediate risk, or the visits are fairly standard if they ever can be, it might be that this is a time to learn that remote working is possible. I know for looking at our role within this, we have all within Inspire recognised that we have lost the time that we spend travelling to different courts. So we now have more time for preparation and paperwork, and we can also undertake hearings in different court centres within a day. So I'm sure that equally applies to all of you. If you had families, for example, in different locations, taking that time out means that you will be able to work a lot more efficiently. We also recognise that nothing really equates to face-to-face hearings, face-to-face visits. There's nothing that will really make it the same as that. So finally, just to look at one thing that Pip mentioned just in a little bit more detail, a chat facility for children to share their views. Again, this is something that we think could be utilised, moving forward, especially for older children, for example, if they have their own mobile phones, or if during a visit they're given the opportunity by their parents to go and sit in another room and speak to professionals on Zoom or another platform. They may, if they are speaking to you whilst they're at home and the parents are in the house, be concerned that mum and dad are listening to what they're saying. So then we have the same problem, that they don't feel open, able to tell what's really gone within the home. So if they had this facility, for example, I know that on Zoom, all of you could message us. So they'd be able to say whatever they felt like saying without mum and dad potentially listening at the door. It would be a safe forum for them to share how they're feeling, and it would negate the concern that the children don't feel comfortable speaking to professionals with their parents stood there, or at least within the close proximity. So that concludes our seminar today. But if any of you have any questions, feel free to ask them now.
You are, I think, all muted. So if you want to ask anything, make sure to unmute yourselves first, please.
Can I ask a question? It's Anwar Jarvis.
Yeah,
I haven't got a video, don't work on my camera. So I work with looked after children, and in terms of you're talking about risk and the assumption, I know it's a wrong assumption that children in care should, be less at risk. Is there still the requirement to visit every 6 weeks?
No, so the regulations alter the original regulation 28 duty. So it's that's changed, which is that the statutory 6 weeks is now kind of altered to add on or as soon as reasonably practicable.
Because if we're making a decision to which visits to do and they're in a settled placement, then it's based on risk, isn't it? So if you think that's a settled placement, there's less risk, there's more of an argument for not doing a face-to-face visit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're under timed pressure, that means you can't do every placement by the 6-week deadline, then you prioritise based on risk, and that's the reason that you're invoking the flexibility. So that seems to fit with the guidance we've got to say, prioritising and risk comes first. And if you don't see that the risk is as great and you've got the struggle to meet deadlines, then I think that way forward makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Just looking at the questions that Iola has asked in the chat. So the first one is, what evidence is there that an increase in domestic abuse will increase in caseloads? How do we know that it will affect additional families to those that we already know about? Increased staffing is very difficult to predict. I absolutely agree, Iola. It is very difficult to predict. We can only really go off the information that we're being given, that the risk in domestic abuse is rising. It may be that they are within the caseloads that there already is, but given the general increase in a rise of domestic abuse, this can then put the children at risk of significant harm. And it's just something that we think that local authorities should be considering, so that just in case, what we don't want to happen is that we get to the point where, for example, we are coming back to some form of normality, the amount of court cases that are going through returns to some form of normal level, and then there isn't the people to be able to run these cases. It's the same for us. We need to make sure that we're all ready and available to do the hearings as well. But I absolutely accept it's difficult to predict what will happen, but I think it's just something that local authorities need to be alive to in the meantime, given that that's the information that we are receiving. And then secondly, you seem to speak about statutory visits. What about parenting and connected persons assessment sessions? Well, Pip and I are actually doing another seminar next Monday. I think it will be at the same time, and this is going to deal with assessments and how they should be done and whether they should be done during this time. So hopefully we'll be able to answer that question next week.
Yeah, I think there's I have a hesitance to go any further than we have with what we said, just on the basis that we might get new information today. So I think I'll try and get the slides to you to look at the link that will be updating. But I think parenting and assessment sessions will probably be one of the things that they address in the update that comes this week, I would have thought.
Just looking at my discussions with social workers over the last couple of weeks, it's trying to get the assessment sessions done at least partially, which I think some of it can be done remotely, but we will deal with that better next week.
Fab.